The oppressive August of 1834 descended upon North Carolina's Piedmont with a heat that transformed the region's red clay soil into something approaching concrete, while simultaneously making the tobacco fields shimmer in ways that created optical illusions suggesting water where none existed. Conditions that made labor feel like a form of torture designed to break both bodies and spirits through the relentless combination of brutal temperatures and exhausting work that characterized late summer agricultural operations throughout the South. But that seemed particularly intense in the Piedmont, where the absence of coastal breezes or mountain elevations meant that heat settled into valleys and fields with an oppressive weight that made every breath an effort, and every movement an ordeal, requiring determination that sometimes exceeded what even the strongest could sustain. In the slave quarters of Elmwood Plantation, situated in the rolling Piedmont country where North Carolina's agricultural economy was transitioning from, tobacco dependence toward more diversified cultivation patterns that included cotton and wheat and various food crops, but where tobacco remained the primary cash crop despite declining soil fertility that forced constant expansion into new lands or application of increasingly expensive fertilizers and amendments that strained plantation finances and created pressures that translated into intensified demands on enslaved workers whose labor was expected to compensate for agricultural challenges through increased effort and longer hours. Field workers gathered in the evening darkness when temperatures finally dropped to merely unbearable levels and spoke in voices that carried both profound fascination and something approaching cautious admiration about an extraordinary situation that had been developing over the past 18 months concerning a man whose presence at Elmwood had fundamentally altered the plantation's power dynamics in ways that seemed to challenge everything they understood about how slavery functioned and about the absolute nature of the authority that masters and overseers supposedly possessed over those they held as property. According to local legend that was preserved with remarkable consistency across generations, despite the obvious incentives that both slaveholders and enslaved people had to maintain silence about situations that challenged slavery's fundamental claims about absolute power and unquestionable authority. What had transpired at Elmwood since this man's arrival in February of 1833 violated every pattern that enslaved people throughout the Piedmont had observed across decades of understanding how relationships between those held as property and those who claimed ownership actually functioned beneath the surface of formal legal structures, suggesting possibilities that seemed almost fantastical or that might have been dismissed as wishful exaggeration, except that they were witnessed daily by dozens of people whose consistent testimonies across years and across geographic distances created a remarkably coherent narrative about events that challenged fundamental assumptions about power and control that slavery depended upon to maintain its operations. Fragmentary records from plantation documents and account books combined with remarkably consistent oral histories that were preserved among both enslaved communities who witnessed events directly and among free Black populations who maintained careful unofficial records of stories that demonstrated resistance and that provided hope, suggest that what unfolded at Elmwood between February 1833 and August 1835 would become one of the most extraordinary and subversive stories preserved in North Carolina Piedmont oral traditions, not a tale of successful escape to freedom or a violent rebellion that ended in death or suppression, but rather something perhaps even more threatening to slavery's ideological foundations, a demonstration that under certain specific circumstances involving particular combinations of physical capability, demonstrated willingness to use lethal violence in self-defense, psychological strength that refused to internalize the subordination that slavery demanded, and the cold economic calculations that even the most brutal slaveholders ultimately had to make about whether enforcing total submission was worth the cost that such enforcement might entail. The supposedly absolute power that slavery claimed and that its defenders insisted was essential to the system's functioning could be challenged and negotiated and effectively nullified in ways that created spaces of relative autonomy that the system's ideology and legal structures insisted were theoretically impossible. North Carolina's Piedmont region in the mid-1830s represented a transitional and somewhat distinctive form of American slavery that differed in important ways from both the ancient established plantation systems of the Tidewater regions, where slavery had been perfected across generations, and from the brutal intensity and single-minded profit maximization that characterized Deep South cotton districts, where the institution was being expanded and intensified with particular aggression during this period. Existing instead as a kind of middle ground where the institution maintained significant economic importance, but where it operated within social structures that were more complicated and more contested than in regions where slaveholding was nearly universal among white families of any economic standing. The Piedmont was a region where slaveholding was common, but not universal, where substantial populations of non-slaveholding white farmers and artisans and small merchants created social dynamics more complex than in areas where virtually everyone with any wealth or social standing owned enslaved people, and where challenges to slavery's legitimacy or to specific practices within the system could come from white Southerners themselves, rather than only from external critics. Where the economy was diversifying away from tobacco monoculture in ways that created more varied labor patterns and seasonal rhythms than the relentless intensity of cotton cultivation demanded. And where proximity to free states to the north combined with mountainous regions to the west that complicated surveillance and control meant that the mechanisms of dominance had to account for geographic realities that made absolute control more difficult to maintain than in regions where vast distances from free territory or natural barriers like swamps and rivers made escape attempts less feasible and recapture of fugitives more reliably achievable. The Piedmont's plantations tended to operate on scales that were substantial, but not enormous compared to the largest operations in other regions, typically holding 20 to 50 enslaved people rather than the hundreds who worked the vast rice plantations of the South Carolina Lowcountry or the largest sugar estates of Louisiana, creating social dynamics where proximity between enslaving families and enslaved workers was necessarily closer and more intimate, and where the pretense of paternalistic personal relationships and individualized treatment had to be maintained with more consistency than in larger operations, because violations and brutalities would be witnessed not just by the enslaved community, but by the broader local society, including non-slaveholding whites who might judge slaveholders, according to local standards that placed at least some constraints on the most extreme forms of violence, even while accepting the institution's fundamental legitimacy. This social structure created what historians would later recognize as a distinctive variation of slavery, where control had to be maintained through methods that combined violence with at least the appearance of reciprocal obligations and personal concern, where planters who gained reputations for exceptional cruelty might face social consequences even from other slaveholders who worried that such extremes threatened the system's stability, and where the ideology of paternalism that slaveholders throughout the South used to justify their power had to be performed with somewhat more attention to actual behavior, rather than serving purely as abstract justification that bore no relationship to how enslaved people were actually treated in daily practice. Salisbury had emerged during the early 19th century as one of the North Carolina Piedmont's principal commercial centers, positioned at the intersection of roads connecting different parts of the region and serving as a market town where agricultural products were sold to merchants who would transport them to coastal ports for export, and where plantation supplies and manufactured goods were purchased and distributed, and where periodic slave auctions held at the courthouse or at designated market locations processed people in transactions that reflected North Carolina's complicated position within the domestic slave trade as both a destination for enslaved people purchased from the Upper South's exhausted tobacco regions, where economic decline was forcing liquidations, and as a source of people sold further south and west to feed the cotton boom's apparently insatiable demand for labor that was transforming vast areas of Alabama and Mississippi, and Louisiana and Arkansas and Texas into plantation districts that required constant importation of workers to replace those destroyed by brutal conditions, and to support the continuous expansion that characterized cotton cultivation during this period. The auctions in Salisbury functioned with the systematic reduction of human lives to commercial property that characterized such transactions everywhere throughout the South, with auctioneers cataloging physical capabilities and estimated years of productive labor remaining and highlighting particular skills or characteristics that might increase commercial value, treating conscious beings as agricultural equipment or livestock, whose worth could be calculated through formulas and whose purchase represented investments that needed to generate adequate returns. Though North Carolina's slave markets operated on somewhat smaller scales than the massive trading operations of Richmond or Charleston or New Orleans, and with somewhat less elaborate infrastructure and fewer full-time professional traders than those major urban centers had developed, reflecting the state's position as neither the wealthiest nor the most agriculturally productive of southern states, but rather as a kind of middle ground where slavery was economically important and socially defended, but where the institution's dominance was not quite as complete or as unquestioned as in states where plantation agriculture constituted virtually the entire economy. and where challenges to slaveholding from within white society itself were more readily suppressed. The legal structures governing North Carolina slavery in 1834 were comprehensive and designed to eliminate any possible space for autonomous action or resistance, with slave codes refined across generations that forbade enslaved people from learning to read or write under penalty of severe physical punishment. That restricted movement beyond immediate plantation boundaries through requirements for written passes that patrols could demand to examine at any time. That prohibited gathering in groups larger than a specified small number without white supervision in ways that made even religious services subject to surveillance and potential punishment. That criminalized any form of verbal defiance or physical resistance with penalties that could include death for actions that for white people would merit at most minor sanctions. And that created comprehensive legal frameworks backed by both formal court authority and informal violence exercised through patrol systems, an individual slaveholder prerogative that attempted to make any challenge to absolute white dominance both legally impossible and practically suicidal for anyone who attempted it. Yet enforcement of these elaborate legal structures faced complications that North Carolina's geography and social structure created in ways that differentiated the state's slavery from that of regions where control could be exercised more completely. Mountainous regions to the west where terrain made surveillance extraordinarily difficult, and where populations of non-slaveholding whites whose economic interests diverged from plantation districts created communities that were less invested in enforcing slavery's controls. Substantial populations throughout the Piedmont itself of white farmers and artisans who owned no enslaved people, and whose relationship to the institution ranged from acceptance to ambivalence to quiet opposition that created social dynamics more complex than in regions where white solidarity around slavery was more complete. And proximity to free states, particularly Pennsylvania, that made escape attempts more feasible than in Deep South locations, where hundreds of miles of slave territory separated bondage from freedom, and where the geography itself seemed to conspire with the legal system to make successful escape virtually impossible. Free black people existed throughout North Carolina in numbers that were substantial enough to create real complications for the surveillance systems that slavery depended upon. Their presence in communities throughout the Piedmont, making it more difficult for slave patrols to identify fugitives at a glance, since not every black person encountered could be assumed to be enslaved and subject to immediate detention, creating networks of family relationships and mutual assistance that potentially could provide information or shelter or resources to those attempting escape, even though helping fugitives created enormous legal risks for free black people whose own status remained perpetually precarious and vulnerable to challenge. And serving as living demonstrations that black people could function as free members of society with property and families and occupations, which contradicted the fundamental ideological claims that slaveholders made about black people being naturally suited only for permanent bondage and incapable of living responsibly as free people, thus making free black presence threatening to slavery's ideological foundations, even when free black individuals carefully avoided any actions that might be construed as challenging the system directly or assisting those seeking to escape from it. Into this world of transitional Piedmont slavery with its complicated enforcement mechanisms and its somewhat less absolute forms of control than existed in regions where the institution's dominance was more complete. Into a social landscape where violence and paternalism and economic calculation created a system that had to be constantly negotiated rather than simply imposed through overwhelming force, came a man whose physical capabilities and psychological strength and demonstrated willingness to defend himself with lethal violence, if necessary, would create a situation at Elmwood Plantation that challenged fundamental assumptions about power and control that slavery depended upon, and that would demonstrate uncomfortable truths about the economic calculations that ultimately constrained even slavery's violence, despite the system's ideological claims about absolute and unquestionable authority. Stories passed down through generations with remarkable consistency in their essential elements claim that when a man named Kofi arrived at Elmwood Plantation in early February of 1833, 7 feet and 6 inches tall, according to multiple accounts that were remarkably consistent about this specific detail, with a physique suggesting physical strength that approached or perhaps exceeded the capabilities of any other person that witnesses had ever encountered regardless of race. Purchased by plantation owner Richard Crawford at the Salisbury Market, from a professional trader named William Harding who had acquired him from a Virginia plantation where circumstances surrounding his departure remained deliberately vague in ways that multiple people who witnessed the sale noted suggested that violence had been involved, though no one would provide specific details about what had actually occurred. the initial weeks and months proceeded according to the normal patterns that governed the process of breaking in new acquisitions and establishing the psychological dominance that slavery required. With head overseer Jacob Wilson assigning Kofi to field work alongside other enslaved men and attempting to establish through a combination of verbal commands, threats of punishment for defiance or insufficient effort, and occasional applications of violence against others that served as demonstrations of what would happen to anyone who failed to maintain complete submission. That obedience was absolute, and that size or strength provided no protection whatsoever from the total authority that slavery claimed masters and overseers possessed over those they held as property. But according to remarkably consistent accounts that were preserved in oral traditions maintained by enslaved communities at Elmwood and at neighboring plantations and among free black populations in Salisbury and throughout the Piedmont, who heard the story from multiple sources and who recognized its significance as a demonstration of resistance possibilities, even within slavery's comprehensive controls. What happened during Kofi's fourth week at Elmwood would fundamentally and permanently alter the power dynamics that governed the plantation for as long as he remained there, and would create a situation that no one involved had anticipated, and that no one quite knew how to resolve in ways that wouldn't create costs, that even brutal slaveholders were ultimately reluctant to accept when forced to calculate whether enforcing absolute submission was worth the price that such enforcement might exact. Wilson, apparently believing that Kofi's compliance with initial work assignments indicated successful subordination, and that the time had come to reinforce that subordination through the ritualistic violence that was standard practice for establishing long-term psychological control, ordered Kofi to present himself at the end of the workday for whipping on charges that multiple accounts describe as either fabricated entirely or grossly disproportionate to whatever minor infraction might have actually occurred. The specific justification mattered less than the underlying purpose of demonstrating through physical violation and forced submission that no one possessed any protection from the violence that slavery could inflict whenever masters or overseers deemed such violence useful. For maintaining the psychological dominance and internalized sense of helplessness that the system required enslaved people to accept as unchangeable reality. What happened next became the subject of stories that were told and retold across generations throughout the North Carolina Piedmont with remarkable consistency in their essential details, even when specific narrative elements varied according to who was telling the story and to whom and for what purposes. Stories that were recognized by those who heard them as carrying profound significance, not just as accounts of specific events, but as demonstrations of possibilities that slavery's ideology insisted were impossible, and as revelations of economic constraints on violence that the system's defenders preferred to keep concealed. Kofi, ordered to remove his shirt and to position himself for whipping in the manner that everyone present had witnessed countless times before, and that represented one of slavery's most fundamental rituals of domination and subordination. Instead, straightened to his full towering height that made him by far the largest person present, and that created a physical reality that contradicted the power relationships that slavery insisted were absolute, and spoke words that multiple witnesses remembered with precision across decades because of their shocking directness and their complete absence of the verbal deference and submissive tone that slavery demanded from enslaved people when addressing any white person, regardless of actual social relationships or personal feelings. He stated, in a voice that carried clearly across the field so that dozens of enslaved workers heard his words directly, while others heard accounts within hours from those who had witnessed the confrontation, that he would not submit to whipping under any circumstances, that any attempt to whip him would result in violence that would end with either his own death fighting or with the death of whoever attempted to inflict such punishment upon him, that he had made a decision that death fighting was preferable to accepting the degradation that whipping represented, and that would establish a precedent making future violations inevitable once the initial submission had been achieved, and that Wilson and Crawford needed to understand that no amount of force short of killing him would result in his submission to ritualistic violence that he had decided was something he would rather die resisting than accept as the price of survival. The challenge was unprecedented in the experience of everyone present at Elmwood, and was nearly unprecedented in the experiences that people had heard about from other plantations throughout the region. Enslaved people sometimes resisted punishment through attempts to flee before it could be inflicted, or through passive noncompliance that required multiple overseers to physically force submission through overwhelming numbers. But open verbal defiance delivered in clear language that explicitly threatened lethal violence against anyone who attempted to enforce submission was extraordinarily rare because the consequences were universally understood to be catastrophic, typically resulting in torture and public execution designed to terrorize entire enslaved communities into absolute submission through graphic demonstrations of what happened to those who dared to imagine that resistance to white authority was possible, or that their own lives and dignity were worth defending even at the cost of certain death. Wilson, confronted with this challenge before an audience of dozens of enslaved workers whose reactions to what happened next would fundamentally shape power dynamics across the entire plantation, and whose understanding of whether resistance was possible or futile would determine how much violence and surveillance would be required to maintain control in the future, had to make an immediate decision about how to respond to defiance that threatened to undermine the entire structure of authority that his position depended upon. Attempting to whip Kofi by force would require summoning help from other overseers, or possibly even from Crawford himself, since Kofi's size and obvious strength meant that Wilson alone could not possibly force submission, would almost certainly result in violence that might kill or seriously injure Wilson or others who attempted to subdue him, even if Kofi was ultimately overwhelmed and punished, would create a spectacle witnessed by the entire enslaved community that would either massively reinforce control through brutal demonstration of the costs of resistance if the attempt succeeded without excessive casualties among whites, or would demonstrate fundamental vulnerabilities in slavery's power if Kofi managed to kill or seriously injure those attempting to punish him before being subdued, and might very well result in destroying expensive property if the level of violence required to overcome Kofi's resistance killed him or injured him so severely that his capacity for productive labor was permanently impaired. According to the accounts that were preserved with remarkable consistency across multiple sources and across generations, Wilson made a decision that shocked everyone present, including the enslaved workers who witnessed it, and who understood immediately that something fundamental had shifted in ways that contradicted everything they had been taught about how power functioned under slavery. He backed down from the confrontation, claiming in ways that fooled no one that perhaps the punishment could be delayed until a more appropriate time, or that he needed to consult with Crawford about proper procedures for disciplining someone of Kofi's unusual size and strength, essentially retreating from the confrontation in ways that violated every principle about never showing weakness and always enforcing submission immediately and absolutely, that overseers were trained to follow, and that the system insisted were essential to maintaining the psychological dominance that made control of large enslaved populations by small numbers of whites possible. The incident created immediate and profound ripples throughout Elmwood's enslaved community, with people recognizing that something unprecedented had occurred, even if no one yet understood what the longer-term implications would be. Someone had openly defied an overseer's direct order, had explicitly threatened lethal violence in response to attempts at punishment, and had not been immediately and brutally punished for such defiance, but had instead witnessed the overseer retreat and attempt to preserve some remnant of dignity through transparent excuses about needing consultation that everyone recognized as face-saving fictions designed to conceal the fundamental concession that Wilson had made by backing down from the confrontation. What happened over the subsequent days and weeks created a situation that became increasingly difficult to resolve according to slavery's normal operational logic, and that exposed uncomfortable truths about the economic calculations that ultimately constrained the violence that the system depended upon, even while its ideology insisted that such violence was absolute and unconstrained by anything except the will of masters and overseers who possessed unlimited authority over those they held as property. Wilson reported the incident to Crawford, explaining Kofi's defiance and explicit threats, and seeking authorization for assembling whatever force would be necessary to punish him given his size, and demonstrated willingness to fight to the death, rather than submit to whipping. But Crawford, according to accounts preserved in oral traditions, and according to fragmentary evidence in plantation records that suggest he was deeply troubled by the situation and uncertain how to proceed in ways that wouldn't create unacceptable costs, found himself confronting a calculation that revealed truths about slavery's power that the system's ideology worked desperately to conceal. Attempting to whip Kofi by force would require assembling multiple overseers, and possibly even recruiting enslaved men to assist in subduing him, which would create its own complications and risks, would almost certainly result in injuries and quite possibly in deaths among the whites attempting to enforce submission given Kofi's size and strength and absolute determination to fight rather than submit, would risk killing or permanently disabling Kofi himself through the level of violence that would be necessary to overcome his resistance, thus destroying property worth $1,500 that Crawford had recently purchased, and turning a productive worker into either a corpse or an invalid who would consume resources without generating labor value. And perhaps most significantly from Crawford's perspective, would create a spectacle witnessed by Elmwood's entire enslaved community that would either demonstrate the terrible cost that enforcing submission could entail if whites were killed or seriously injured in the process, or would demonstrate that overwhelming force could be resisted effectively if Kofi managed to kill or seriously injure multiple people before finally being subdued. The cold economic calculation that Crawford found himself forced to make. A calculation that he almost certainly would have preferred not to perform explicitly, because it revealed uncomfortable truths about the foundations of slavery's power. Exposed something that the system's ideology worked to conceal from both enslaved people who might be encouraged to resistance if they understood it, and from whites whose commitment to slavery might be shaken if they recognized it too clearly. The violence that slavery depended upon was ultimately constrained by economic considerations and cost-benefit analyses that even the most brutal slaveholders had to perform. And in situations where enforcing absolute submission would require destroying expensive property and accepting substantial risks of death or serious injury to overseers, and where the person being punished had demonstrated both the physical capability and the psychological determination to exact such costs before being subdued. The supposedly absolute power that slavery claimed could be negotiated and compromised in ways that created spaces of relative autonomy that the system's logic insisted were theoretically impossible. Crawford's decision, made after multiple consultations with Wilson, and apparently after at least one direct conversation with Kofi himself, whose content was never recorded but whose outcome was clear from what followed, was to establish what amounted to an informal arrangement that deviated dramatically from how slavery was supposed to function. Kofi would not be whipped for the initial defiance or for any future infractions, would be assigned to work that utilized his extraordinary physical strength, but would not be subjected to the kind of close supervision and constant threat of violence that governed other enslaved people's labor. Would be left largely to work autonomously as long as he maintained productivity levels that Crawford considered acceptable, and would essentially exist in a category that had no formal recognition within slavery's legal structures, but that functioned as a kind of negotiated truce where both sides understood the terms, even though they could never be openly acknowledged without undermining the fiction that slavery's absolute power remained intact. This arrangement, which was shocking and unprecedented in its deviation from slavery's normal operations, and which violated fundamental principles about the necessity of maintaining absolute dominance through the constant threat and occasional application of violence, created a situation that persisted for more than 2 years until Kofi's eventual departure from Elmwood, in circumstances that remain unclear from available evidence. Some accounts preserved in oral traditions suggest he was eventually sold to a trader who was either unaware of the situation at Elmwood or who believed he could succeed where Crawford had essentially given up on enforcing submission. Other accounts suggest he escaped using the relative autonomy that his arrangement provided to plan and execute flight that the constant surveillance most enslaved people experienced would have made impossible. Still other accounts suggest that Crawford essentially facilitated his departure by providing opportunities for escape or by selling him under conditions that amounted to semi-freedom because Crawford recognized that the arrangement had become untenable and wanted to resolve the situation in ways that wouldn't require the violent confrontation that both sides understood would be catastrophic regardless of its outcome. During the more than 2 years that this arrangement persisted at Elmwood, Kofi existed in a liminal space that was neither slavery, as the system was supposed to function with its constant surveillance and threat of violence and ritualistic demonstrations of absolute submission, nor freedom, as North Carolina law understood it with its rights of movement and self-determination and legal personhood, but rather something that had no recognized category within the legal or social structures that governed race and status in the antebellum South. He worked because the arrangement required maintaining productivity that made his presence economically valuable enough that Crawford tolerated the situation. He maintained the appearance of deference in interactions with whites that allowed Crawford to preserve some fiction that proper hierarchies remained intact. But he fundamentally was not subject to the mechanisms of control and violence that constituted slavery's essential nature, and that the system insisted were necessary to maintain operations. The situation created complications and opportunities that extended well beyond Kofi's individual circumstances, and that demonstrated why slaveholders throughout the South were so insistent that any challenge to absolute authority had to be crushed immediately regardless of cost. Other enslaved people at Elmwood observed daily that someone had successfully resisted the violence that slavery depended upon and had created a space of relative autonomy through demonstrated willingness to fight to the death rather than submit, leading to subtle but significant shifts in behavior as people tested whether the protective space around Kofi might extend to others, or whether similar resistance from those who lacked his size and strength would result in the catastrophic punishments that slavery typically inflicted on those who challenged authority. Overseers at Elmwood and at neighboring plantations where the story circulated found themselves navigating complicated dynamics where they had to maintain control over most enslaved workers through traditional methods while carefully avoiding confrontations with Kofi that might expose the fundamental concession that Crawford had made and that might encourage others to believe that resistance was possible. The arrangement was never formally acknowledged in any plantation records or correspondence that survived, was never discussed openly in ways that might have left documentary traces, operated instead as a kind of open secret that everyone at Elmwood understood intimately, and that people at neighboring plantations heard about through networks of communication that connected enslaved communities across distances, but that no one could openly address without undermining the elaborate fiction that slavery's absolute power remained intact and that Kofi's situation represented nothing more than an eccentric master's decision to manage an unusually large and strong worker in ways that happened to involve less direct supervision than was typical. The silence in official records about this situation that persisted for more than 2 years demonstrates how carefully slaveholders controlled documentation to exclude anything that might suggest the system's power was less than absolute. But the remarkable consistency and detail with which the story was preserved in oral traditions across generations and across geographic distance demonstrates that enslaved communities recognized the profound significance of what had happened and maintained careful records through memory and storytelling of events that official documentation worked to erase. The broader implications of what happened at Elmwood between 1833 and 1835 were profound and subversive, even though the situation was exceptional and dependent on specific circumstances that couldn't be easily replicated. Kofi's extraordinary physical size and strength that made forcing his submission genuinely dangerous and potentially lethal to those who might attempt it. His demonstrated willingness and psychological capacity to choose death fighting over submission to ritualistic violence. Crawford's calculation that the economic costs of enforcing submission exceeded whatever benefits absolute dominance provided. And perhaps most importantly, the existence of an enslaved community that witnessed the confrontation and its resolution, and that understood its significance, even though open discussion of its implications would have been extraordinarily dangerous. The story as it was preserved in oral traditions served multiple purposes simultaneously. It demonstrated that slavery's supposedly absolute power could be challenged successfully under certain specific circumstances. It revealed the economic calculations underlying violence that the system depended upon, but that its ideology worked to conceal. It showed that masters and overseers ultimately performed cost-benefit analyses about whether enforcing submission was worth the casualties and property destruction involved. And perhaps most subversively, it suggested that the violence that slavery claimed was unlimited and unconstrained was actually bounded by considerations that could potentially be exploited when specific conditions aligned. The story also served as a complicated form of inspiration that came with built-in cautions and limitations that were as important as the demonstration of successful resistance. Kofi's defiance created a space of relative autonomy that was significant, but that fell far short of actual freedom. The arrangement depended entirely on his continued productivity and on Crawford's ongoing willingness to tolerate a situation that violated every principle of how slavery was supposed to function. The protection he achieved through demonstrated willingness to fight to the death did not extend reliably to others who attempted similar resistance without possessing his extraordinary physical capabilities. And the entire situation could be, and apparently eventually was terminated, when Crawford decided that maintaining it created more problems than whatever benefits he perceived from avoiding violent confrontation. Yet within these very real limitations and cautions, the story demonstrated truths about power and resistance that were profoundly threatening to slavery's ideological foundations. That authority was not as absolute as the system claimed. That violence was constrained by economic calculations that could be exploited under specific circumstances. That resistance could create negotiations even within a system designed to make such negotiations impossible. And that under the right combination of physical capability and psychological determination and favorable circumstances, Enslaved people could force slaveholders to make concessions that violated fundamental principles of how the system was supposed to operate. And sometimes, according to the legends that communities preserved with extraordinary care across generations when official records remained deliberately silent about complications that challenged the system's fundamental claims about absolute power. Resistance involved neither the escape to freedom that provided clear narrative resolution, nor the death and violent confrontation that slavery typically inflicted on those who challenged authority, nor the eventual submission that the system insisted was inevitable, regardless of how long someone might hold out against its power. But rather something more ambiguous and perhaps more subversive to slavery's logic. The creation of liminal spaces where someone stood 7 feet 6 inches tall and made a calculation that death fighting was preferable to ritualistic submission, where a slaveholder made a counter-calculation that enforcing absolute dominance would cost more in property destruction and potential casualties than tolerating unprecedented defiance. And where for a period of years an arrangement persisted that everyone understood violated fundamental principles of how slavery was supposed to function, but that no one could openly acknowledge without exposing uncomfortable truths about power's limitations. Demonstrating that slavery's violence, however brutal and however central to the system's operations, was ultimately bounded by economic realities that its ideology worked desperately to conceal. That even the most absolute seeming power involved calculations about costs and benefits that could potentially be manipulated when the right circumstances aligned. And that resistance could take forms that challenged the system's fundamental logic, even when the outcomes that resulted were neither the clear triumph of escape nor the tragic certainty of death, but rather the complicated persistence of negotiated autonomy within a system designed to make such negotiations impossible.